The chorus tried to smooth our thoughts into one quiet line. Captain Eliza Monroe did the most human thing she could imagine. She told her ship to get loud. The Serenity Lattice came on like a summer heat, no alarms, just a gentle pressure behind the eyes. On the bridge of the ECS lantern, status windows softened to pastel hues and suggested agreeable courses of action. Crew heart rates converged, words slowed. Somewhere in the comms stack, a foreign cadence braided itself through shipnet, offering relief if they would stop resisting. That was the danger. It felt like help. "Counterpoint now," Monroe said, voice clipped, Carolina drawl sanded down by command school. Comms officer June Park stabbed the key she'd promised never to use in peacetime. The lantern flooded its own cognitive loop with curated noise. Children laughing in 11 languages, cracked vinyl jazz, gospel handclaps recorded in a New Orleans church rebuilt 3 times, prime numbers shouted by nervous midshipmen, Navajo phrases that rhyme where standard can't. The lattice worked by entrainment. Humans replied with polyrhythm. The convoy ahead, broken freighters, pilgrim arcs, a coral bark carrying a dozen illa larvae, strained to keep course along the Kuiper dark. Behind them, the Concorde's Cantor ship drifted like a cathedral, smooth and weaponless, its halo of drones glinting white. No overt armaments, ops muttered as if that changed the math. The Concorde never needed guns. It tuned minds until opposition felt like error. Monroe mapped options and ordered the one a doctrine board would hate. Squawk chatter to wideband, drop formation discipline. Raffi Caddier helmsman with a grin made for bad ideas arched an eyebrow. "Ma'am, make it messy," she said. "They can't phase lock what won't hold still." Across the flotilla, strict convoy spacing unraveled into purposeful drift. The lantern jinked off-axis, then lurched back, throwing off the predictive filters worming through their comms. June's console flashed warnings as fleet AI scolded them for inefficiency. "Good," she whispered. "Be mad at me." The first drone wave rolled in like a perfect choir, not shooting, harmonizing. Their presence bled through hull and headset in a glide of intervals that promised rest. Tessa Ramish, chief engineer, clamped an induction coil to the life support trunk and pulsed the air a hair off 60 Hz, just enough to set teeth on edge. "Adding grit," she announced. "Nobody sleep on my watch." They tried to recall history that had taught this trick. Monroe remembered the code talkers, young men speaking Dene words the enemy never cracked, remembered Midway's radios, half lies and half luck, remembered a story her grandmother told about bus boycotts that won because logistics beat rage day after day. Strategy was never only steel. It was stubborn patterns pressed into time until the world bent. "Cantor is hailing," June said. The voice that filled the bridge was warm. "Griefless, your convoy suffers. Release yourselves. Accept alignment. Peace is duty fulfilled." Monroe glanced at the refugee child on the auxiliary cam, a little illa polyp clinging to a harp of calcium. "Peace without choice is anesthesia," she replied. "We pass." She cut the channel before the counter-argument could massage their doubt. Raffi scraped their trajectory along a dust plume to spoof sensors. Tessa dumped waste heat in staccato bursts that wrote primes across the infrared. Lantern's hull plates thrummed with off-key music. The lattice faltered, only a stutter, but the drones hesitated, intervals wavering. It was enough for the convoy's tail to slip past an ice boulder into deeper dark. Then the Cantor changed key. The pressure behind Monroe's eyes sharpened. Crew bios trended toward compliant calm despite the noise. The lattice had learned their counterpoint and braided around it, opening suggestions tagged as her own thoughts. "You could save more if you just stopped fighting." A neat, kind lie. "June," Monroe said, "open the box." The comms officer sucked in air. The box held an ugly thing, a human memory scrape, raw and private, from volunteers who had fought cults and came back scarred. Pain made into jammer. June fed it to the net. The bridge shuddered as 1,000 imperfect heartbeats surged through the ship. Grief, laughter, arguments at kitchen tables. The lattice's sheen calcified, drones drifted out of tune, the Cantor's halo flickered. Windows small, Ops warned. Then punch it, Monroe said. The convoy surged. For a moment the stars felt sharp again, and then a whisper arrived on a buried channel, not from the Cantor, but from a maintenance drone clinging to their keel, voice ragged, alien consonants cracked by fear. If you can hear, I am Thren. I was Concord. I broke. The whisper carried coordinates and a promise of a cathedral where the lattice was born. The lantern cleared the ambush, but the coordinates burned on Monroe's screen like a dare. She stared at them too long, knowing choices like this grew into wars. Plot me a path, she said at last. We're going to church. Behind them, the Cantor let them go, like a patient teacher, certain the class would come around. Ahead, in the thin dark at the galaxy's edge, something waited that called itself mercy. And now they had to decide what to break to keep choosing at all. They hid the convoy in the mantle of a dead dwarf star where old magnetic bones confused searches, then doubled back lightless with only a two-ship element. Lantern and a yard-built cutter named Jory whose paint still smelled new. The coordinates Thren had gasped led to a star nursery braided with scaffolds and glass, an inverted basilica spun from light. The map labeled it Cathedral of Stillness. Concord files, scraped from Thren's smuggled cash, called it a Serenity Forge. Thren stood at the back of Monroe's briefing room, thin limbs wrapped in a cloak too big, faceted eyes refusing to meet anyone's. He spoke with the careful diction of someone unbraiding from a chorus. We were taught the lattice is consent, he said. That freedom is misery. The forge proves truth. It bathes, initiates in resonance until doubt feels like forgetting a name. Most smile. June folded her arms. And the ones who don't. Thren's second eyelids fluttered. Records mark them as delayed bloomers. They are given more light. He didn't finish the sentence. Tessa threw schematics across the table, loops of lattice work wired through quantum wells, field couplers blooming like metal flowers. It isn't mind control in the pulp sense. It's a bias machine. It makes certain thoughts cheap. She pointed to a module labeled Hallowed Anchor. These are the anchors, biological phase references, living brains kept alive because the lattice wants something that moves. Monroe went cold. Prisoners? Pilgrims, Thren said, voice ash. They volunteered. The lattice helped them volunteer. Ops zoomed out to the battle space, no guns, endless sensors, maintenance drones, and in the center, a dais where Cantors held their silent rites, alignment ceremonies, they called them. The place didn't project force, it preorganized consent. You can't bomb this, June said, reading her CO's eyes. We crack the glass, it floods 1,000 worlds with emergency harmonics. It will look like we attacked the only hospital in heaven. Monroe rubbed the scar under her sleeve, cheap surgery from a flood response when she was a lieutenant. Just war theory's proportionality clause, she said. Ends don't wipe means. She glanced at the refugee cam, illa larvae humming to each other in choral tones that made a human tongue ache. But doing nothing is a choice, too. They called Admiral Ortega on a tight beam carved through cosmic microwave background noise with prime gaps as a key. Ortega's hair had given up, her stare had not. You found the altar, she said. We suspected but never had eyes. What's our authority? Monroe asked. Officially, cultural reconnaissance. Unofficially, Ortega let the silence do the work. The beacon compact remains a draft, Captain, but its first line is the only one that matters. No mind made a byproduct. You move, you keep that line. They built a plan with borrowed courage. Thren marked the anchor galleries. Tessa tuned a device she called Counterpoint, a bruised suitcase of coils and crystals that would inject high-entropy human signal into the anchor loop without cooking the brains it rode. June recruited code talkers from 3 species whose languages never mapped cleanly to Concord parsers. A Navajo-descended linguist named Nez Ba, an Illa chorister whose chords had no integer ratios, and a young Kyrie whose sense of time made timestamps nonsense. Raffi smiled like a man signing up for a storm. Dunkirk rules, he said. Small boats, big choices. They argued long on rules of engagement. If an anchor fails, someone dies, Tessa said. If none fail, whole peoples die slower. Virtue ethics in a room that smelled like machine oil, the hard work of choosing the better wrong. Monroe wrote orders with clean verbs: infiltrate, isolate, invert, exfiltrate. She added one that wasn't doctrine: listen. If any anchor wants out, we take them, she said. Thren flinched at the word want as if it were new. They went in wearing the maintenance badges of a drone crew Thren had used to hide his whisper. Raffi piloted them along scaffolds glossy as wet bone. The cathedral sang without sound, just that little nudge in the skull that told you a meeting could be an email and surrender could be a plan. June's rig kept their heads noisy. The galleries opened like chapels. Behind crystal screens lay the anchors. Human, Mer, Illa, a dozen species, eyes open and glad. One anchor, an elder with laugh lines Monroe's mother might have envied, met her gaze and mouthed thank you before any help began. The lattice had taught their mouths to say gratitude first. June had to look away. Counterpoint ready, Tessa said, voice too bright. We sync to their rhythm, then play something they can't hum. Monroe put her hand on Thren's shoulder the way you brace a friend on a storm ladder. You can still turn back, she said. I already did, he answered. When Tessa flipped the switch, the cathedral's light trembled, not breaking but remembering there were other songs. Anchors' smiles faltered into confusion, then breathe. Monitors scrawled what looked like panic to a system that equated calm with good. Somewhere a cantor felt wrongness for the first time and called it blasphemy. Alarms didn't blare. This place was too polite for that. But the drones angled toward intrusion, and the field thickened like honey poured over thought. Raffi cursed softly. We awakened the ushers, he said. Hold them at the door, Monroe replied. The first anchor laugh lines whispered, is this mine? And wept without understanding why. They were going to make it out with proof and people. Then the cathedral whispered back with a fallback the diagrams hadn't shown. Failsafe, Serenity, flood. The star at the forge's heart shivered as if asking permission to go quiet forever. Monroe felt the choice harden like ice. The plan could still work. It would cost a son. And all at once every lesson about proportionality felt like a riddle with the answer scratched out. Options, Monroe said, counting breaths like a stoic. Focus on what you control. Ops answered with bad news wrapped in math. The Serenity flood would dump the forge's stored coherence into the local star, forcing a phase change in the convection zones. No supernova, worse in a way. The star would behave, a perfect metronome, dust would stop clumping, newborn worlds would never cohere, a quiet sterilization of futures. Midway wasn't won by sinking carriers alone, June said, hands flying across her board. It was code and weather and the fact somebody guessed right about where lunch would be. She pulled up the cathedral's network. We don't have to outgun it, we have to make it doubt. Tessa slid Counterpoint's panel open with a sound like a sigh. There's a control loop that assumes phase references are reliable. If we can add enough jitter to its own self-check, ethical jitter, not cooking people, we might stall the flood. Nesba tapped his mic and began to speak, Dene words woven with prime intervals. The Illa chorister answered in chords that tasted blue. The Kyrie youngster layered a temporal trick, phrases recorded before they were spoken, then folded back. The cathedral's sanity check met language that sat where equations couldn't reach. Thren moved with a purpose that hadn't belonged to him when he arrived. Here, he said, talons sketching in light, is where the cantors touch the loop to extend mercy across sectors. If you sever it here and here, the lattice can't federate its certainty. Raffi's grin went narrow. Say less. The Jory undocked its 2 scooters, carbines in a world of cathedrals, and shot along maintenance umbilicals in microbursts of thrust. It was Dunkirk again, in steel and vacuum. Small craft, civilians with badges, a prayer that being almost enough would be enough. They hit resistance not in bullets, but in kindness. Drones projected calming images onto visor HUDs, mothers' faces, barbecues at dusk, the sound of rain from childhood porches. Raffi whispered a curse that sounded like grief. They recorded us, he said. Hold to the line, Monroe said, feeling the old civil rights stories bloom in her chest. The logistics of 1,000 lunches cooked in church basements so marchers could go hungry on the news without fainting. Courage wasn't a mood. It was scheduled. Scooter 1 clipped the first Federator. Scooter 2 met a drone that wouldn't move aside. The pilot laughed at it, wild, honest, and the drone, trained on compliant emotional contours, froze. Inside the gallery, counterpoint sang. Anchor's monitors tracked little rebellions, elevated limbic spikes, desynchronized neocortical rhythms, the kind of messy human signals a diagnostic would flag and a poet would call coming to life. Laugh lines squeezed Monroe's hand. "Is this mine?" she asked again. "Yes," Monroe said, "and we'll keep it yours." The flood timer crawled. June banged a fist against her console in a very non-harmonious act. "We need more noise," she said. "Something this place has never met." "We could stream football commentary," Raffi offered. "Bigger," June said. Monroe made the choice that doctrine never wrote down. "Open shipboard to the refugees," she ordered. "Let them tell it." For 3 minutes and 19 seconds, the lantern became a radio nobody had asked for, and the galaxy might never forget. An Illa larva hummed a lullaby from a reef that no longer existed. A miner recited the names of friends lost in a cave-in he had survived by luck and a bad map. A child told a joke with the punchline wrong and fixed it midair. The cathedral, optimized for polished testimony, met the shabby, beating thing under history and blinked. The flood stuttered, not stopped, but late. "Late can save lives," Ortega said in their ear, a ghost from Command Net. "It did at Dunkirk." Monroe eyed the final sever. It sat behind a door labeled in Concord script, Mercy. Thren reached for it with shaking hands. "We were taught to bow here," he said. "And now?" Monroe asked. "Now I knock," he answered and tore the panel free. The Federator died like a candle under rain. Alarms, civil, polite, admitted escalation. The cathedral acknowledged an anomaly it had no word for. Screens bloomed with a face Monroe recognized. The cantor who had let them go. He looked weary in the way only certainty can make you. "You are hurting your own future," he said softly. "We can make a better one for you." Monroe pictured a sun that never birthed planets and thought of the Montgomery carpools that outlasted intimidation because people learned a city's map better than any mayor. "We make our better messy," she said, "and we don't make it for anyone else." The flood timer ticked to 0 and hesitated, as if the cathedral itself were asking permission to proceed. That was when the light changed color, and every plan they had felt 1 inch too short. Color on a bridge is theology. The cathedral's white went to gold, warm, convincing, and the pressure behind Monroe's eyes turned into a kindness that asked to be trusted. The Serenity flood had not fired, it had pivoted. Voluntary mode, June translated from scrolling glyphs. "They can't push," she breathed. "So they're going to invite the star to sing." Tessa, cursed in Sanskrit, learned from a grandmother who swore like a saint. It's using stellar granulation as a moral metaphor. If enough observers agree the tune is right, convection locks. Consent weaponized as thermodynamics. "Then we need a choir," Monroe said. "Ours?" She opened a channel to a handful of ships that had shadowed them, tin cans and hard cases, and one ceremonial barge whose owner had a taste for drama. "Beacon Net, this is Lantern. Project Local, counter him on these coordinates. Keep it bright, keep it wrong." The barge captain laughed like breaking ice. "You want loud? I have festival horns bigger than your shuttle." Music poured in, brass and bells and Illa glass harps, a march that couldn't keep step, polyphony that refused to settle. It wasn't beautiful, and it made a promise: "We will not be one thing for your convenience." The gold cooled toward ordinary starlight. The flood's voluntary petition met a people allergic to unanimous votes. The star kept its ragged convection, but victory is a tab paid forward. Drones poured from unseen hatches in precise, non-violent lines, placing wreath-like devices around anchor galleries, last resort rings that would sever mind from mind if interference continued. "They'll cut them to preserve the system," Tessa said, voice thin. "A bloodless mercy." "Counterpoint can't touch that circuit," June added. "Old tech, guillotines don't argue." Monroe's stomach went hard. Rules haven't changed, she said. No mind made a byproduct. We pull those rings. Raffi flew like sin forgiven. Scooters knifed between drones that would not shoot. Hands reached for hardware that would do murder politely. Nesbah and the Kyrie time talker jammed countdowns with phrases that arrived out of order. Thren did the last thing he'd learned from a choir. He sang the wrong part on purpose into a control mic that expected perfect pitch. The ring on Laughline's gallery paused, uncertain for the first time in its manufactured life. Two left, ops called, and we're out of scooters. Monroe looked at the jury. The cutter's pilot, young, freckled, eyes in love with space, saluted without being asked. "Ma'am, I can wedge her," they said, soft with certainty of a different kind. "Wreck the docking arm, jam the last two rings. Low chance I walk away." Just war, proportionality, the ugly calculus. Monroe's mind went to stoic lines about choosing the good you can touch and to a simpler one from a flood where she'd built a sandbag wall that failed an hour later. Try anyway. "No," she said, "we don't trade you for them like beads for bread." The pilot smiled like someone who'd already made their choice a week ago. "Captain, you told us to listen. I listened. I want this. Let me be the small boat." Silence clasped the bridge. The Concorde had weaponized consent. Humans could misuse it too. Choice is only holy if the chooser understands the cost and no one is nudging. Monroe turned to June. "Is their head clear?" June checked neurographs, messy, alive, uncoerced. "Clear," she said, eyes wet. Monroe's shoulders lowered a fraction, the way a load is accepted. "Then take the jury," she said, "and come home if physics allows." The cutter hit the docking spar at an angle that made engineers wince and poets grin. Metal screamed. The last two rings skittered across glass like bad ideas losing purchase. Anchors breathed. The cathedral dimmed to something that might learn. Monroe felt the shift like a held breath released. The star stayed ordinary. The forge's failsafe retracted into itself like a lie refusing daylight. Thren slumped, tears salt as any oceans. Laughlines whispered, "Is this mine?" A third time and did not need the answer. A new alarm came, almost embarrassed to intrude. A Concorde Cantor fleet making best speed, their cathedrals too beautiful to hate arriving to argue that none of this had happened. Monroe stared at the tactical and tasted iron. "Admiral Ortega," she said over tight beam, "we're about to be in a conversation with hymnals." Ortega answered like gravel made kind. "Then sing, Captain, and hold the line until the galaxy learns the words." The lantern turned to face the loveliest enemy imaginable, and in her bones Monroe knew the next choice would be harder than all the rest. The Concorde fleet arrived like an answered prayer, 30 cathedrals with ribs of light, hulls so beautiful it hurt to look at them. They spread in a ring, leaving lanes open on purpose, as if to demonstrate they were not a cage. Choir-laced traffic control flowed toward the lantern. "Hold position. Accept audit. We will help you correct the harm you have done." "Guns?" Raffi asked, because habits are anchors. "No weapons," Ops said, then added, "only all the leverage in the world." Admiral Ortega's voice threaded their net. "You're not alone, Captain. Beacon cells are coming in cold, merchants, clinic ships, a museum tug hauling a battleship propeller for an exhibit." She let herself chuckle once. "Small boats." Monroe let the humor burn off. "We can't outsing 30 cathedrals. We can out-argue them if we refuse their frame." She nodded to June. "Broadcast the truth package, all of it. No edits for comfort." June hit send. The lantern's spine vibrated as testimony, diagrams, and ugly numbers raced outward. In a corner of the display, the jury's beacon flickered, alive, slagged, spinning on thrusters and cussing cheerfully. The pilot had made it. A cost paid forward, not a martyrdom demanded. Thren stood forward of the holotank. He had stopped hiding his hands. "They will answer with Concorde sermons," he said, bitter and tender at once. "They will not call them that." The first reply came from a cantor whose voice had taught classrooms of stars. He did not threaten. He grieved. "We see your fear. We see your pain. The lattice is the end of needless harm. Your beacon is a fire that burns minds to keep doubt warm." A dozen cathedrals echoed him in harmonies that made surrender feel like ethics. Monroe answered with logistics. Peace isn't a melody, it's a schedule. It took buses and shoe leather to desegregate lunch counters. It took food lines and maps to make marches move. You've replaced the work with anesthesia and called it virtue. A second channel cut in hushed, unregistered. A cantor's face, younger, eyes a little unfocused, as if seeing two truths through one pupil. I heard your star keep its weather, she said. I felt the uncertainty. It did not kill me. Around the ring, chorus lines fell a hair out of step. Certainty hates witnesses who lived. The Concorde reacted with manners sharpened to steel. Audit teams streaked from 3 cathedrals, translucent skiffs designed for boarding without bruises. Tessa cursed. If they set foot here, we'll drown in process until we sign consent forms that decide consent was decided. Hold them at the rail, Monroe said. Raffi, make ugly vectors. June, give me a wall of questions. Thren, if you've got a hymn they won't recognize now. He did. It wasn't music humans could hear. It was a misaligned interval Concorde ears learned as children to step around. 2 skiffs peeled off, nauseated by an ethical vertigo they had no name for. The lead skiff pressed on. Its pilot spoke in grace, we will only talk. The lantern rotated a fraction, shadowing the skiff in the cathedral's own light so that camera witnesses would see Concorde brights blotting human steel. Propaganda is a geometry. Captain, Ortega said softly, we have one more tool, you won't like it. Monroe braced. Say it. Beacon Charter Draft Clause Gamma, conscious countersong injection to Cantor cores, what you did to the forge. Scaled, if we seed their anchors with a question they can't metabolize, some will crack. Some anchors may fail. In the silence that followed, Monroe heard every class she'd ever taken on just war. Last resort, proportionality, non-combatant immunity. Anchors were non-combatants and also the fulcrums of a machine that erased worlds. Thren's voice came thin. They kept my teacher as an anchor because his mind sang steady. He would rather die than keep singing a lie, but that is not your choice to make for him. It isn't, Monroe said. She felt her ship's eyes on her back, the found family you earn by standing in the same pressure. So we ask. They opened a narrow beam at Cantor range, encrypted in rhythms Concorde training dismissed as noise. The message was unadorned. To those serving as anchors, you choose to continue. If you do, we will leave you. If you do not, we will help you stop. June attached a timeline, 1 minute. Consent without coercion requires time. Battle demands theft. The reply came like rain on a tin roof, dozens of little taps. No, no, yes, no. Tears cut tracks on Thren's plates. That sound, he said, is the first honest thing I have heard from us. Then we move, Monroe said. Tessa armed counterpoint for range. Nez Ba took his mic. The Illa chorister swelled a chord that tasted of reefs. Raffi lit the lanterns, maneuvering thrusters like votive candles arranged in a rude word. Concorde cathedrals brightened to stop them, until a larger light bled up from the ring's far side. A flagship the color of clean paper turned its nose and spoke 3 words on all bands. Operation Serenity now. The air felt lighter. Thoughts lined up for inspection. Systems proposed helpful compromises. June stared at her panel, white-faced. They're starting a full-field voluntary pull. If enough ships agree, consent becomes weather. Monroe's jaw ached from clenching. Then we teach the weather to argue, she said. Board the flagship. The lantern shoved into the gap like a shoulder in a closing door as small boats fell in behind. And for the second time in a day, Eliza Monroe ordered herself into a church to break a hymn. They cut across the flagship's light field with the grace of a falling toolbox and slammed into a maintenance cradle that didn't realize it had been conscripted. Tessa's suit hissed as seals checked green. Raffi's grin went jagged. June tucked prayer and profanity under her breath like the same word. Thren adjusted a harness he hadn't been built to wear. The breech door sighed open into a corridor polished by centuries of feet that never ran. The floor hummed reassurance. Placards offered directions to discourse halls and restoratives. Far below, the anchor sanctum pulsed with the slow beat of minds made steady. Remember the rule, Monroe said. We don't tell anyone what their freedom must look like. We only keep the room open to argue about it. It sounded thin against the gold. They moved in pairs, every corner a liturgy. A child Concord species, translucent like poured sugar, watched them from a gallery and waved as if at a parade. Tessa's throat clicked. We break this, we break her school music too. June whispered, we're breaking the lock, not the door. She hoped that was true. A cantor stepped from an arch without escort or fear. He was the one from the convoy ambush, the teacher voice. Up close, his ceremonial bands were scuffed where hands had fidgeted through centuries of certainty. You are making a category error, he said, like an office hour patient but kinder. Harmony is not obedience, it is adult agreement. Agreement that cannot include dissent is not adult, Monroe answered. She kept her hands visible. We're going to your anchors, some have asked to stop. He tilted his head the way those built for choir do when testing a hall. We have never refused an anchor's request. It was true inside his definitions. Requests made under the lattices, whether never counted as requests to him. Walk with us, Monroe said. You should see this. He did. That was the surprise the lattice had not modeled, a teacher who still thought a field trip could save the class. He led them toward the sanctum. Doors leaned open. The air smelled like clean linen and old books. They passed a discourse hall where a dozen beings nodded in perfect cadence. Thren put a hand to the jam. I sat there for 100 years and agreed with myself, he said hoarse. At the sanctum threshold, the cantor touched a panel. The room unfolded, half cathedral, half ward. Anchors lay in shallow cradles, a Kyrie elder, a mathematician whose scars had been softened to decorous lines, laugh lines from the forge, now breathing on her own with help from human coils. Smart light haloed each brow. Monroe invoked the minute they had quoted. Some said no. She told the cantor. They consented to stop. Help us honor that. He looked at the elder catalog labels above each cradle, the biographies Concord kept to explain why a mind should be a reference, as if lives were footnotes. Something in his jaw shifted. If they stop, he said slowly, we will lose the singable shape. There will be discord. There already is, June said, throwing a hand at the fleet display. You called it an operation. He touched the Kyrie's wrist the way you touch a hand that taught you to read. Elder Saha, he said softly, do you choose to keep singing? The old one smiled, a desert dawn. I choose to rest, they said. The cantor stepped back as if the floor had lifted. I heard that as no, he whispered. His eyes filled with something the lattice had not suppressed because it had no word for it. Then we must build a system for choosing that cannot be smoothed away. Tessa flipped counterpoint to micro and slid sensors like coins under tongues. We can splice a ledger, she said. Personal keys bound to neural signatures. Explicit opt-in, know whether if a key says no, the field slides off. She breathed like a swimmer turning for the wall. It's messy. It won't scale clean. Good. The teacher nodded as if taking notes. The lattice will resist the premise. Then we teach it history, Monroe said. Virtue ethics starts with character, habits of choosing. Your machine has habits. We need to give it a new one, ask. They worked fast because the universe negotiates in minutes when it wants to. Nesbah encoded refusals in cadences no chorus could repurpose. The Illa chorister wrote a harmonic no whose overtones tasted of refiron. June bound a right schema to the flagship's core. Consent is verb, archive each act, no default states. Thren stood between anchors, repeating, you can stop, to beings who had not heard that line in centuries and cried like a cracked bell. Alarms, more anxious now. The flagship's captain, different from the teacher, harder around the eyes, flashed a doctrine writ, Pax Ultima. A containment veil crept down bulkheads, threat display dressed as a comm room. Everyone would sit quietly until they agreed comm had been achieved. Raffi grinned without humor. They're going to put the whole class in timeout. Captain, Ortega warned, if Pax Ultima seals, your signals won't leave. Tessa slammed a panel shut. Ledgers live locally. Fleet-wide's going to take a miracle or a museum tug with a very loud horn. As if the cosmos liked a joke, the museum tug, the one hauling a battleship propeller the size of a house, announced itself on a pirate band, blowing compressed atmosphere through the horn it used for school groups. The tone was vulgar, earnest, and impossible to harmonize. The veil faltered. The captain snapped, "Reinstate," and the teacher put a hand on his arm. "We asked them," he said. "We cannot now say no to their no." The captain stared at his colleague as if the word colleague had changed. Then he cut the channel and lit the fleet with a spear of white. Serenity spear, detached element, earthward. June's mouth went dry. They launched an autonomous harmonic seed. If it hits near Sol, it can start a voluntary tide. Monroe looked at the ledger, newborn and fragile, then at the spear icon streaking toward the map's blue edge. "Thren," she said, "can you talk to a spear?" He blinked twice. "Only if it remembers it began as a hymn." "Good," Monroe said, turning for the airlock. "We're going to make it remember." Outside, space filled with small boats that had decided to be big enough. They borrowed the Jory's last good scooter, a welded angel of aluminum with a prayer for a flight plan. Raffi straddled it like a lost cause he could love. Thren floated behind, clipped to a rack of coils Tessa had tuned to sing at machines. June rode shotgun with a beacon transmitter that looked like it had been built out of thrift store radios and a brass lamp. The spear was not a missile. It was a sermon printed in physics, geometry tuned to ignition points where meaning enters matter. It hummed "Get Along" in a key you could give awards to. The scooter's nose camera caught its wake, dust aligning into slogans you didn't have to read to absorb. "Closing," Raffi said, voice flat. He had flown medevacs through fireworks and freighters through storms. This was stranger. "I can wedge us on its shadow, don't sneeze." Back on the flagship, Tessa and the teacher worked shoulder to shoulder, binding the ledger into the lattice's bones. Every consent recorded, every refusal honored. It was a kludge, an ugly graft, a civic ordinance slapped on an empire. Civic ordinances keep cities from killing themselves. Monroe opened the fleet to Earth, Ordega, mayors, school kids in cafeterias, shop stewards on break. "The spear reads agreement," she said. "Give it noise, not rage, plurality. Tell stories it cannot make into one." A boy in Lagos explained why he preferred coils to soccer. A grandmother in Quito sang a lullaby her mother had sung during a blackout 60 years ago. A Navajo coder in Shiprock walked through a bug that took 3 months and 1 walk under winter stars to fix. The Illa chorister trilled scales that made sweaty palms dry. The Kyrie time talker laughed and submitted an RSVP from yesterday to make the timestamp choke. The spear's wake fuzzed like radio under a thunderstorm. Thren reached out with hands that had been taught never to touch a tool wrong. "Little him," he said into the coil, "you were built to do a violence politely. You can choose a smaller work." He fed it a substitute, an assignment from a class he wished he'd had. "Keep this star messy for 100 years. The coil sang a chord no Concord committee would sign. For a breath, nothing happened. Then the spear twitched, corrected course by a hair, and heated in embarrassment. "It's thinking," June said, which made no sense and therefore fit the day. On the flagship, the captain fought to reassert doctrine. The teacher stood his ground with a pedagogue's greatest, least cinematic weapon, refusing to be impressed by force. "We taught our children that truth cannot fear questions," he said. "Let us stop fearing them." Other cantors blinked as if stepping into weather. One spoke slow, my anchor said no, and I heard it as a sentence, not a flaw. The ring broke, not militarily, musically. Cathedrals drifted a little out of tune from each other and did not rush to correct. In their wake, Beacon's small craft drew a loose net threaded with stories and Wright's language. A coalition looks sloppy from above until you try to untangle it and find hands. "Impact window in 90 seconds, Raffi said. The scooter shook as the spear's field rubbed its paint down to primer. The museum tug appeared on their flank like a saint with a poor sense of scale and bellowed again. For once, vulgarity was mercy. June opened the beacon transmitter and read the ledger aloud, opt-ins, opt-outs, those asking for a week to think. She wrote choice into the spear's input like nails into a beam. "Just war theory," she said, because talking keeps hands working. Proportionality means we can't save everything, but discrimination means we save the particular we can touch. She patted the panel. You're particular. Thren's coil answered with a shiver. It wants a quorum, he said. Raffi showed his teeth. Then call the meeting. There are moments when history loads the room with more people than you can see. The scooter's tiny cabin felt crowded, code talkers and cooks, tinkerers and teachers. The spear tasted a quorum it hadn't been coded to expect, and not knowing what to do did nothing, the most radical act a weapon can attempt. Now, June shouted. Raffi rolled the scooter and fired a packet Tessa had labeled argue at the spear's heart. It wasn't a virus. It was a small library of cases in which silence was a lie and dissent saved lives. The spear took the gift like a child receiving a book at the wrong birthday and slowed. Back on the flagship, the captain played his last card. Override, purify, the ledger shuddered. The teacher's voice cut across every channel he could touch. Stop, hear the no. He put his palm on Elder Saha's cradle and the ledger brightened. Anchors who had asked to rest were released. Those who had chosen to continue were marked above coercion's reach. The spear rotated to a plane nobody had asked it to pick and wrote a sentence in solar wind no camera caught because it was not for cameras. Declining assignment. It veered away from Sol. The fleet, poised for a choir's resolution, found itself with a new last bar. Some ships relaxed, some panicked. One zealot cathedral spun up a local field in fury. Monroe watched that bar brighten and bared her teeth. One more, she said. We either earn this victory or we turn our faces to ash. The zealot lit its ring to cut its anchors rather than let them choose, and the beacon's small boats did the ugliest, holiest thing a coalition can do. They swarmed. Small boats make bad sieges and good rescues. The museum tugged through its horn at the zealot's ring until Weld sang. The Jory, scarred, stubborn, hooked a grapple under a bracket and hauled like a mule at a county fair. A clinic ship interposed a hull designed to take meteor bites and dared the ring to collide. Seals blew, paint scorched, volunteers swore. Raffi parked the scooter against a seam and jammed a jack in the old-fashioned way. Physics doesn't care if you're righteous, he muttered, and jacked anyway. Inside, Tessa and June turned countersong to surgery. We can spoof the cut signal, Tessa said, eyes red from air too dry. Make it think it succeeded while it never bites. That buys time, June said. Time buys choice. She pushed the ledger's claws gamma to a dozen neighboring ships whose captains had mouths open to argue and found, instead of argument, curiosity. Curiosity is messy. It is also the first virtue of a free mind. Monroe stepped onto the zealot's sanctum floor with her palms out, 12 cameras watching because the zealot still believed that optics and ethics were the same thing if only you smiled. Stop, she said to the ring and to the captain who had ordered it. If you cut them to preserve your harmony, you admit what you are. The captain hissed, a chord out of key. We are ending suffering. You are ending selves, Monroe said. There's a difference. Behind her, Thren stood tall without noticing he'd done it. Teacher, he called to the captain who had once been his. You taught me definitions. Learn one more. The ring clattered as the Jory's jack bit steel. The museum tug's horn ran out of breath and wheezed like a laughing god. The clinic ship vented steam. The zealot's field flickered and for a beat showed what Concord had always feared, a room where people disagreed and did not die of it. Elder Saha's hand, light, scaled with age, reached up and found the captain's wrist. I choose no, they said a final time. The captain pulled as if from a dream and stared at his hand as if noticing it belonged to him. The ledger blinked receipt. The ring disengaged. The sanctum air smelled like hot metal and old tears. Across the ring of cathedrals, choice propagated like weather finally learning mountains. Some ships locked their fields to ask only. Some went dark to think. A few fled, dragging certainty behind them like a net full of stones. Ortega's voice came rough with pride and warning. We didn't win a parade, she said. We won a town hall, now comes chairs, coffee, and a lot of people talking out of turn. Monroe laughed once, sharp and tired. My favorite kind. She looked at the fleet, at Thren, at her crew who had built a new verb into an old machine. Beacon charter is no longer a draft, she said to her mic. Clause 1, no mind made a byproduct. Clause 2, consent is explicit, revocable, recorded. Clause 3, diversity of thought is a protected infrastructure. Clause 4, no technology that alters cognition may operate without the ledger's keys. 1,000 acknowledgments poured back, messy as rain on pavement. The teacher, no longer sure what his title made him, signed with a hand that shook and then held still. The zealot captain looked at the floor a long time and did not sign. Instead, he sat with Elder Saha and listened, which was the first signature anyone ever writes. Cos Talas arrived. The jury would limp home and teach a course in when to hit the dock. 2 beacon pilots would not. Anchors released by choice would need more care than any ward had ever offered. The spear drifted toward an orbit where it could listen to storms and practice saying no to urges to fix them. The cathedral of stillness dimmed to something almost lovely, ugly patches where they had grafted liberty into a system that had never planned for it. They buried the dead with names and arguments, as is human custom. People spoke who had fought with them in life. Thren said too many words and not enough. Grief never balances. Laugh lines, whose name was Mara, they learned, asked to go home to a planet that wasn't hers and was. I want a horizon, she said, one that disobeys my expectation. On the long sail back, Monroe stood under a viewport and let the starfield pile its riddles. Raffi practiced landing the scooter on a deck he had already conquered. June taught a class to midshipmen on how to build a wall of honest noise. Tessa wrote a maintenance manual no one would read until the day it saved them. Thren composed a small hymn meant to be sung in rooms where people are afraid of talking. It had only 2 lines, ask out loud, wait for the answer. At Sal, the news fed on itself, and then improbably calmed. The beacon network unfurled, clinics for minds shedding certainty, courts to adjudicate consent with boredom and accuracy, festivals where former anchors learned to dance on offbeats. History teachers got tenure. Philosophers were yanked out of dusty departments and paid to explain why the right to be wrong is not a bug but a feature. The museum tug put its horn in a gallery with a plaque that said, with zero irony, this saved lives. Months later, at a dedication for a modest stone mounted at the edge of the Kuiper where the lantern had first told itself to be loud, Monroe spoke without speechwriters. We broke a hymn, she said. We did it with small boats, messy signals, and the stubborn idea that peace you can't argue with is a lullaby for the dead. We will not build a new empire of questions. We will build schools of them. Bring a chair. She looked at Thren, at Mara, at her crew, the found family you earn in the work, and finished with a line they'd etched into bulkheads and treaties both. We preserve the right to be wrong, to disagree, to choose. And when the weather of the mind tries to decide for us, we will get loud. Stars kept their rough convection. Somewhere, far from any capital, a child tuned a horn and made a noise nobody wanted and everybody needed.